silent even among themselves. The workers were divided into gangs, with the labor conscripts and the civilians kept apart. Armed soldiers guarded each working group. The tracks were cleared in several places at the same time by separate gangs. Mounds of snow between the sections hid the gangs from one another and were left untouched until the last. The workers spent all day in the open, going back only to sleep. The days were clear and frosty, and the shifts were short because there were not enough shovels. It was sheer pleasure. Zhivago's section of the track had a fine view. The country to the east dipped down into a valley and rose in gentle hills as far as the horizon. On the top of a hill there was a house exposed to all the winds. Its park must have been luxuriant in summer but could not give it any shelter now with its frosty lacework. The snow smoothed and rounded all contours. It could not quite conceal the winding bed of a stream which in spring would rush down to the viaduct below the railway bank, but at present was tucked up in the snow like a child in its cot with its head under the eiderdown. Was anyone living in the house on the hill, Zhivago wondered, or was it standing empty and falling into ruins, held by some land committee? What had happened to the people who had once lived there? Had they fled abroad? Or been killed by the peasants? Or had they been popular and were they allowed to settle in the district as technical specialists? If they had stayed, had they been spared by Strelnikov or shared the fate of the kulaks? The house teased his curiosity but kept its sorrowful silence. Questions were not in order in these days, and no one ever answered them. But the sun sparkled on the pure whiteness with a glare that was almost blinding. How cleanly his shovel cut into its smooth surface. How dry, how iridescent, like diamonds, was each shovelful. He was reminded of the days when, as a child in their yard at home, dressed in a braided hood and a black sheepskin fastened with hooks and eyes sewn in the curly fleece, he cut the dazzling snow into cubes and pyramids and cream puffs and fortresses and the cities of cave dwellers. Life had had zest in those far-off days. Everything was a feast for the eyes and the stomach. But these 3 days in the air, too, gave the impression of a feast. And no wonder. At night the workers received loaves of hot fresh bread, which was brought no one knew from where or by whose orders. The bread had a tasty crisp crust, shiny on top, cracked at the side, and with bits of charcoal baked into it underneath. 16. They became fond of the ruined station, as one becomes attached to a shelter used for a few days on a climbing trip in a snow-bound mountain. Its shape, its site, the details of its damage, remained imprinted in their memory. They returned to it every evening just as the sun, as if out of loyalty to the past, set at its usual place behind an old birch tree outside the telegrapher's window. At that spot the wall had caved into the room, but the corner facing the window had remained intact. With its coffee-colored wallpaper, the tiled stove with the round vent and the copper lid closed with a chain, and the inventory of the office furniture hanging on the wall in a black frame. As before the collapse, the setting sun brushed the tiles, brought out the warm brown glow on the wallpaper, and hung the shadow of the birch on the wall as if it were a woman's scarf. At the rear of the building, on the nailed door to the ruins of the waiting room, there was still an announcement, put up in the first days of the February Revolution, or shortly before it, which said, "Sick passengers are temporarily requested not to bother about medicines and bandages. For obvious reasons, am sealing door, of which am giving notice hereby. Medical Assistant Ust-Nemdinsk District." When finally the last piles of snow between the cleared tracks were leveled, the entire line of rails came into view, flying into the distance like an arrow. On each side stretched white mountains of shoveled snow, bordered all along by the black walls of the forest. As far as the eye could reach, groups of people with shovels in hand stood at intervals along the line. Seeing themselves for the first time in full force, they were astonished at their numbers. 17. It was learned that the train would leave shortly, despite the lateness of the hour and the approaching night. Yuri Androvich and Antonina Alexandrovna went out to enjoy the sight of the cleared line once again. No one else was on the tracks. The doctor and his wife stood a while, gazing into the distance, exchanged a few words, and turned back to their car. On the way they heard the angry voices of two quarreling women. They recognized them at once as those of Ogriskova and Tiegunova, who were walking in the same direction as they were, from the head to the end of the train, but on the station side, while the doctor and his wife walked on the wooded side. The endless line of cars screened the two couples from each other. The women seemed hardly ever to be abreast of the doctor and Antonina Alexandrovna, but always to be ahead of them or falling behind. They seemed to be in a state of great agitation, and it was as though their strength failed them. Judging from the way their voices rose to a shriek or died down to a whisper, either their legs refused to carry them or else they kept stumbling and falling into snowdrifts. Tiegunova seemed to be chasing Ogriskova, perhaps belaboring her with her fists whenever she caught up with her. She showered her rival with choice abuse, and her genteel, melodious voice made the insults sound infinitely more obscene than the coarse and unmusical swearing of men. "You slut! You drag-tailed whore!" Tiegunova screamed. "I can't move an inch without seeing you flouncing up and down, and ogling. Isn't my old fool enough for you without your having to make eyes at a babe in arms, to seduce a minor? So Vasia too is your legal husband? I'll give you legal husband, you filthy plague. One more word from you, and I'll kill you. Don't tempt me. Now, keep your hands to yourself. What do you want of me? I want to see you dead, you lecherous louse, you cat in heat, you shameless bitch. That's what I am, is it? Naturally, I'm nothing but a cat, a bitch, compared with such a grand lady as you. Born in the gutter, married in a ditch, a rat in your belly, and a hedgehog for a brat. Help! Help! She'll kill me. Help a poor orphan, help a poor defenseless girl. Come along, Antonina Alexandrovna urged her husband. I can't bear to listen to it, it's too disgusting. It will end badly. 18. Suddenly everything changed, the weather and the landscape. The plains ended, and the track wound up hills through mountain country. The north wind that had been blowing all the time dropped, and a warm breath came from the south, as from an oven. Here the woods grew on escarpments projecting from the mountain slopes. And when the track crossed them, the train had to climb sharply uphill until it reached the middle of the wood, and then go steeply down again. The train creaked and puffed on its way into the wood, hardly able to drag itself along, as if it were an aged forest guard walking in front and leading the passengers, who turned their heads from side to side and observed whatever was to be seen. But there was nothing yet to see. The woods were still deep in their winter sleep and peace. Only here and there, a branch would rustle and shake itself free of the remaining snow, as though throwing off a choker. Yuri Androvich was overcome with drowsiness. All these days he lay in his bunk and slept and woke and thought and listened. But there was nothing yet to hear. 19. While Yuri Androvich slept his fill, the spring was heating and melting the masses of snow that had fallen all over Russia. First in Moscow on the day they had left, and since then all along the way all that snow they had spent 3 days clearing off the line at Ust-Nemdinsk. All that thick, deep layer of snow that had settled over the immense distances. At first the snow thawed quietly and secretly from within. But by the time half the gigantic labor was done it could not be hidden any longer and the miracle became visible. Waters came rushing out from below with a roar. The forest stirred in its impenetrable depth, and everything in it awoke. There was plenty of room for the water to play. It flung itself down the rocks, filled every pool to overflowing, and spread. It roared and smoked and steamed in the forest. It streaked through the woods, bogging down in the snow that tried to hinder its movement. It ran hissing on level ground or hurtled down and scattered into a fine spray. The earth was saturated. Ancient pine trees perched on dizzy heights drank the moisture almost from the clouds, and it foamed and dried a rusty white at their roots like beer foam on a moustache. The sky, drunk with spring and giddy with its fumes, thickened with clouds. Low clouds, drooping at the edges like felt, sailed over the woods and rain leapt from them, warm, smelling of soil and sweat, and washing the last of the black armor plating of ice from the earth. Yuri Androvich woke up, stretched, raised himself on one elbow, and looked and began to listen. 20. As they approached the mining region, there were more and more settlements, the runs were shorter, the stations more frequent. More people got on and off at the small stations. Instead of settling down and going to sleep, those who had only a short way to go found seats anywhere near the door or in the middle of the car and sat up arguing in low voices about local matters intelligible only to themselves. From the hints dropped by such local passengers in the past 3 days, Yuri Androvich gathered that in the north the whites were getting the upper hand and had seized or were about to occupy Uriatin. Moreover, unless he had misheard the name or his old friend had a namesake, the white forces were led by Galialin, whom he had last seen in Melyartsevo. Not to worry his family, he said nothing to them about these unconfirmed rumors. 21. Yuri Androvich woke up shortly after midnight brimming with a vague feeling of happiness, which was, however, strong enough to have aroused him. The train was standing still. The station bathed in the glassy dusk of a white night. Something subtle and powerful in this.